Welcome to the deep dive. We take the sources you share with us and really dig in to uncover unexpected insights and maybe, a few aha moments. Today, we're diving into some material that offers a really challenging perspective on the American economy. It argues for a fundamental shift in how we think about prosperity, putting work and family right at the center.
That's right. The source material you sent over, it gives us this comprehensive look at the history of U.S. economic policy, analyzes the consequences for workers, and then lays out some, frankly, surprisingly different paths forward. What's particularly interesting, I think, is how it connects these areas you might not normally link, like environmental rules, education, trade, social programs, all through this one lens, the health of the labor market.
Right. And our mission today is just to unpack this specific viewpoint from these sources. We want to understand the core problems they're identifying, explore the alternative solutions they're proposing, and see what this whole perspective might mean for you. And just to be clear, we're not taking sides here. We're simply exploring the ideas presented in the material you shared.
Exactly. So we'll start with the historical context. The source's diagnosis of what they argue went wrong. Then we'll dig into how this viewpoint sort of rethinks major policy areas like trade and the environment. From there, we'll look at their ideas for institutions, unions, the safety net, and then finally touch on the role they argue culture plays, which is, a bit less tangible but still important.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The sources kick off with a pretty bold claim, arguing that somewhere around the mid-20th century, U.S. economic policy really shifted. It started prioritizing, aggregate national growth and consumption, things you measure with GDP, over maybe the interests of typical workers and the stability of their communities.
Yes, and the analysis suggests this wasn't just random. It actually flowed from, changing economic theories and the policies based on them. The focus became basically get the fastest overall growth possible and then figure out how to redistribute some wealth rather than designing the system so the labor market itself created broad prosperity and opportunity right from the start.
And according to the sources, the results, they haven't been great for a lot of people. They point right at stagnant wages for average workers, particularly men, and those without a four-year college degree. There's this really striking statistic they cite. Median weekly earnings for full-time workers barely budged, rose only 1% in real terms between 1979 and 2007, almost 30 years.
Right.
And for men, and those with less than a bachelor's degree, earnings actually fell during that time.
Yeah, declined. And the sources link this economic picture to significant social costs, arguing that just relying on redistribution hasn't really solved the underlying issues in the job market. They point out the huge increase in means-tested government spending, welfare programs since the 1960s. It hit over $1 trillion annually by 2015.
$1 trillion? Wow.
Which works out to more than $20,000 per person living in poverty. But, and this is their key point, despite that massive spending, the poverty rate hasn't really gone down much in recent decades.
Right. And the material doesn't pull punches on the human cost either. It cites studies on that really alarming rise in deaths of despair, suicide, liver disease, drug overdoses, particularly among middle-aged white Americans with lower education levels. The sources emphasize this is, historically unprecedented in the U.S. and not something you see in other developed nations to the same degree.
And what's fascinating here is how the sources argue that just focusing on GDP growth and redistribution misses something crucial about what makes a society truly prosperous. They introduce this concept they call productive pluralism. The idea is that real societal health comes from offering multiple valid ways for people to engage in productive activity, paths that respect different skills, different life choices, not just funneling everyone towards whatever maximizes their economic output in some narrow sense. They basically argue that a healthy society, strong families, meaningful work is the foundation for real prosperity, not just a byproduct of growth.
So GDP isn't the full picture.
Okay.
Right? How do the sources explain what's actually going wrong inside the labor market itself? Why isn't it providing these productive opportunities they talk about?
Well, the source material defines the labor market pretty simply. It's just the process connecting people who can work with employers who need work done. Basic enough. But crucially, they stress that unlike, say, a market for computers, just having an efficient outcome isn't enough. For society to function well, this market has to provide meaningful work for enough people so they can support families and build communities.
Okay, but you hear constantly about automation, right? Robots taking all the jobs. What do these sources say about that? Is that the main problem?
That's a really big point they tackle head on. They argue that the common story, widespread job destruction driven purely by technology, the evidence doesn't really back it up, according to them. They point to things like, Productivity growth has been pretty sluggish for decades. Capital investment isn't as high as it used to be relative to history. The ratio of production workers to managers hasn't drastically changed. All these things, they say, don't really fit the picture of technology making huge swaths of the workforce obsolete right now.
Well, they have some interesting examples too, don't they? Like even in steel, which is highly automated, it still took like 40 years just to quadruple output per worker. Or that lots of factories are still using software from the 90s, or even control systems from the 60s. And they mentioned Elon Musk saying too much automation at Tesla was actually a mistake.
Yeah.
Exactly. Musk saying humans are underrated. So this leads the sources to ask, okay, if automation isn't the main driver, what is causing this stagnation for many workers? Their suggestion is that the industrial economy, while efficient, has kind of stalled in terms of output growth. So fewer workers are needed each year to make the same amount of stuff. And unlike in past eras, overall output isn't growing fast enough to soak up those workers elsewhere in manufacturing or related sectors.
But technology could still change where people work, couldn't it? Even if it's not wiping out jobs entirely.
Oh, for sure. They discuss that geographical dimension. Innovation often creates these prosperous city hubs, right? We see that in places like Seattle or New York. But they argue that some newer technologies, think 3D printing, advanced e-commerce, maybe eventually self-driving trucks, could theoretically make distance less costly. This might spark a sort of renaissance in smaller scale production, maybe allowing jobs to spread out more geographically. But, and it's a big but, they stress that public policy choices really matter here. They determine whether investment stays concentrated or actually disperses.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because the sources argue that a lot of our existing policies, maybe policies made with good intentions, have actually made the problem worse. Let's get into those trade-offs.
Right. The material goes through specific policy areas, looking at them through this lens of labor market health, and argues that our current approaches often make trade-offs that end up disadvantaging typical workers.
Okay, like environmental regulation. The sources absolutely acknowledge the huge successes, right? Cleaner air, cleaner water. They cite those dramatic drops, like lead down 99%, carbon monoxide 85% between 1980 and 2016. Huge public health wins.
Undeniable benefits, yes. However, the sources argue that the way some of these regulations are designed, specifically things like the Cleaner Act's new source review, ends up penalizing new factories or major upgrades to old ones. They contend this makes it harder and more expensive to expand industry domestically, which in turn might reduce the demand for physical labor. They question if that specific balance is still the right one for today's challenges, particularly the lack of good jobs for less skilled workers.
Yeah, the source material is pretty critical of how cost-benefit analysis gets used in regulation. They suggest it often doesn't properly weigh the economic costs, especially the social costs when people lose jobs like those deaths of despair we talked about. They float this provocative idea. Maybe regulators should have to put a value on a statistical job right alongside the statistical life they already calculate and just be way more upfront about the tough trade-offs involved.
Which brings up that core question the sources pose. How do we balance really important environmental goals with the goal of having widespread productive jobs? Their suggestion is maybe once you've achieved broad environmental improvements, the policy focus needs to shift. Perhaps away from squeezing out every last bit of pollution regardless of the cost, and more towards prioritizing industrial expansion, even if that means accepting slightly less environmental purity than is technically possible.
Okay, let's shift gears to education. Here, the sources argue our system is, well, kind of obsessed with college for all. And they claim this leaves a lot of students actually unprepared for the world of work, especially since test scores haven't really improved much nationally for decades.
The material contrasts the U.S. approach, which has generally resisted tracking students into different career paths early, with what many other developed countries do, using vocational training and apprenticeships much more widely. They also point out this disconnect. You ask college presidents what college is for. They say, critical thinking, lifelong learning. You ask the public, they overwhelmingly say, getting a good job.
So the sources are suggesting we need a different idea of equal opportunity. Not necessarily equal outcomes for everyone, but removing the barriers so that everyone, whatever path they take, has a realistic shot at finding a productive way to support a family. Which, they argue, means shifting serious resources and focus away from just the college track towards these other pathways that, let's face it, most people actually end up taking.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture, globalization comes up too. Both immigration and trade, the sources argue, present really significant trade-offs when you look at them from this specific labor market perspective.
On immigration, they make a distinction between skilled and unskilled workers coming in. Their argument is basically, if your specific goal is to boost the economic prospects of less skilled native-born workers, then the case for large-scale unskilled immigration kind of falls apart.
Why? Because it directly increases the labor supply right in that segment, which tends to hold down wages for those jobs.
But also push back against that common phrase, immigrants take jobs Americans won't do.
Right. They cite data showing native-born workers are actually the majority in basically all job categories, even the ones often mentioned, and they suggest that sometimes letting a labor shortage happen can actually be, well, productive. It can push businesses to invest in training, improve wages, or working conditions to attract domestic workers. They mention a Home Depot example where a shortage apparently led the company to invest significantly in training construction workers.
Okay, and then there's trade. The source material argues pretty strongly against the standard view that just more trade is always better, especially if you're only judging it by whether we get cheaper stuff, the more goodies argument.
Exactly. They adopt what they call a production lens, and from that angle, they argue that consistently running big trade deficits, importing way more than we export, actually hollows out our domestic production capacity. It sends capital overseas, moves supply chains abroad, and makes it harder for the U.S. to compete in important industries down the road. They point to other countries, especially China, engaging in what the sources call mercantilist practices.
Like IP theft, state subsidies.
Yeah, state-backed industrial policies like Made in China 2025, which explicitly aims for dominance in key sectors. They mention state support for specific companies, or even how China used incentives to get Tesla to build a factory there.
And the sources argue the U.S. has sort of tolerated this, maybe partly out of fear of a trade war. But they say this approach isn't really sustainable and isn't actually free trade anyway.
Yeah.
Their proposed alternative involves being more assertive, demanding actual reciprocity and market access, seriously boosting funding for domestic R&D and manufacturing tech, like funding it at NIH levels for things like advanced materials or robotics.
And also using financial policy to help rebalance trade, maybe even blocking foreign takeovers of key U.S. assets by countries engaging in practices harmful to U.S. production. And what's really striking here is that the sources aren't just talking about minor adjustments. They're proposing pretty fundamental rethinks about how we balance different values and goals in policy, putting the health of the domestic labor market front and center. The sources also look at institutions, things like organized labor, the social safety net, and even, culture, how all these shape the labor market and how we value work.
Right. With unions, they argue the current model, the one based on the NLRA from way back in 1935, is kind of outdated and maybe not that effective anymore, partly because regulations now cover a lot of things unions used to bargain over.
So the material suggests exploring other models, things like co-ops or maybe works councils, focus more on collaboration between workers and employers. They even float ideas where maybe regulatory rules could be part of the negotiation and where political lobbying is kept separate from representing workers on the job. They point to things like the Ghent system in Europe,
where unions administer unemployment benefits.
Exactly. Which leads to high membership without forcing people to join or pay dues. The point is, they argue, mutually beneficial arrangements are possible beyond the current adversarial model.
Okay, then the safety net. The sources are really clear. It's vital for people who truly cannot work. No question there. But they're quite critical of how the current system works for people who are able to work.
They note the massive spending, that $1 trillion+ a year across many agencies. But they argue the way it's set up actually discourages work for many. They explain how when you stack up different benefits, housing, food stamps, healthcare subsidies, you can hit these benefit cliffs, earn a little more money from a job, and you lose benefits worth even more than the raise.
Which effectively creates these incredibly high marginal tax rates on working for low-income families, right?
Exactly. They give that statistic in many states. The value of benefits for a single mom with 2 kids can actually be more than she'd earn working full-time at minimum wage. The sources argue this crushes the income gap, the financial reward for working versus not working, which is the fundamental incentive driving people towards self-sufficiency through work.
So what's the proposed fix?
Well, one idea they push hard is a transparent, immediate wage subsidy. Basically, topping up the pay for low-wage workers directly based on hours worked. They argue this would be way better at connecting people to jobs and could potentially replace big chunks of the current welfare system, maybe even without costing more, given how much is already being spent. They even suggest employers should benefit too, making it cheaper to hire and train low-skill workers.
They also mentioned something called a flex fund.
Yeah, basically giving states big block grants of federal safety net money based on population, poverty levels, but with a lot of flexibility on how to use it locally. The idea is to spur innovation and local accountability. Let communities figure out the best ways to support those who need help while moving others towards work.
Okay, and finally, culture. This is harder to pin down, but the sources argue it's really important. They make the case that culturally we just don't value or respect work the way we used to.
hmm They point to things like how work is portrayed in popular culture. Fewer blue-collar characters on TV since the 80s, for example. And when they do appear, they're often depicted as, relics from the past.
And the sources argue that devaluing work, or blurring the lines between being idle and being productive, isn't actually liberating. They see it as a kind of deprivation. It reduces the rewards, both internal and external, for doing hard work. They talk about restoring a respect gap, suggesting that maybe trying too hard to remove any stigma from not working has unintentionally lessened the respect given to working.
And from that cultural viewpoint, they see ideas like universal basic income, UBI, as really problematic, even dangerous. They argue UBI would fundamentally undermine the role of work in society, making work purely optional, totally separating consumption from production. It basically puts the government in the role of primary provider for potentially millions of people.
Yeah, the source material has that really provocative thought experiment, suggesting UBI advocates should try it on their own kids first if they think it builds independence. Kind of makes you think.
Yeah.
So, wrapping this up, this deep dive into the sources presents a really powerful, and probably for many, a challenging argument that focusing just on GDP growth and redistribution has maybe come at a real cost to the labor market for many Americans, fueling some deep social problems.
And they propose that the path forward needs a fundamental shift in how we think, explicitly prioritizing the renewal of work and family life, and being willing to make some potentially tough trade-offs in policy environment, education, immigration, trade, institutions, even culture to get there.
It's definitely a perspective that doesn't fit neatly into the usual left-right boxes, is it? It criticizes too much faith in the market, which you might hear from the left, but also criticizes government programs and mandates that distort the market, which you might hear from the right.
Right. They argue both approaches have, in their view, failed many workers. The core message seems to be that we have to acknowledge real trade-offs exist, and we need to reorder our fundamental social priorities, think bigger than just taxes and spending if we want lasting prosperity in a healthy society.
So what stands out to you, the listener, after hearing this particular perspective on the economy and the role of work?
Maybe consider this final thought drawn from the source material. If our goal really is to build a society where pretty much everyone can find meaningful work that lets them support a family, live in a decent community, and give their kids a shot at a better life, does the path we're currently on, regardless of our politics, actually make that outcome more likely or less?
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope it's given you a lot to think about and maybe some new angles to explore.